Has man always lived with dinosaurs? Some people say this is absurd, but young Earth creationists who insist that it's true should be able to find examples of man living with dinosaurs in the Bible. First, keep in mind that the first use of the word dinosauria wasn't used until 1841 by famous British scientist Sir Richard Owen, so you won't find the word dinosaur in the Bible. The King James Version of the Bible, written in 1611, has the term dragon 35 times in the text. Newer versions written and put under copyright in the last 50 years, such as the NIV, do not mention the word dragon, but all of those versions originated most likely from the Latin Vulgate, which do mention the word dragon in the text. It's only been in recent times that the publishers removed the word dragon. Obviously, the text has been altered by modern man wishing to push an agenda. So if dragons, or dinosaurs, lived with man, wouldn't we see references in the Bible? Probably the first and best place to look would be the dietary instructions given by the Creator to Moses in Leviticus 11. In this chapter, every kind of animal is basically covered, and we are told which animals are to be as food and which animals are not. So as we turn to Leviticus 11, let's first pause on verse 20. All fowls that creep going upon all four shall be an abomination unto you. Depending on which Bible version you are using, you will have a number of translation differences. Some Bible versions refer to insects in verse 20, but that wouldn't make any sense because we know that insects by their very definition have 6 legs or more. And verse 20 is clearly talking about 4 legs. You see, the verses immediately before verse 20 are talking about fowl as birds, and the verses immediately following verse 20 are talking about insects. But notice how verse 20 and verse 23 are almost identical in the English, Hebrew, and the Greek. Why would the author of Leviticus put verses that almost say the exact same thing just a couple of verses apart? It's simple. Verse 20 is ending the section of animals considered to be birds or large fowl of the air, and verse 23 is ending the section for flying insects. It's interesting to note that the writer may have considered insects as having 4 legs in verse 23 because usually the back 2 pairs of legs are used for propulsion, and the front pair is used mostly for manipulation and guidance. The mere positioning of verses 20 and 23 should make it seem obvious that one is referencing insects and one is talking about fowl being birds of the air. The modern day translators didn't know what to do with verse 20, so many recent publishers simply changed the word fowl to refer to insects in the text, even though all older versions of the text say fowl.
What was that?
No.
Did you see that? You know there are still people who won't believe they could fly? I tell you, the sky was once filled with them.
I'm looking for Dr. Robert Hugh.
Oh, is either of you a paleontologist? I desperately need a paleontologist.
No, we're high school students.
Oh, pity.
Paleontology today clearly teaches that pterosaur-type animals were quadrupeds and walked on all fours. They were animals that flew in the air and would clearly be described as fowl in Leviticus chapter 11. And since we know that other fowl walk on only 2 legs, but pterodactyls walked on 4, they fit the verse perfectly. Modern day translators have a lot to answer for in changing the text of the scripture to adapt to their modern worldly way of thinking. In doing so, they have misled millions turning to the word of the Father for understanding. While verse 20 would account for flying pterosaurs, what about land dinosaurs? The text in Leviticus 11 makes clear that only animals with a split hoof and those that chew the cud are to be considered food. That would of course remove many animals, including any known predatory and grass-eating dinosaurs. Leviticus 11 verse 26. The carcasses of every beast which divideth the hoof, and is not cloven-footed, nor cheweth the cud, are unclean to you. Every one that toucheth them shall be unclean. Then we see an interesting verse in Deuteronomy 7 verse 22. And the Lord thy God will put out those nations before thee little by little. Thou mayest not consume them at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon thee. Here we see the 12 tribes of Israel are standing before the Jordan River, ready to go into the land promised to their forefather Abraham. However, in the midst of the land exist many pagan people whom Israel is going to have to fight in order to live there. It will take time to inhabit all the land and occupy it. Rather than empty the land of all the pagans at once to allow Israel to move in right away, the Father keeps them there in order to maintain the land so that the beasts of the field would not become too numerous. This is approximately 750 years after the flood, and while dinosaurs did not grow as large as they once did during pre-flood times due to a collapsed canopy and other variables, they were still a formidable force in the land if encountered in great numbers. Think about it. God is clearly saying for the benefit of his people, he doesn't want the beasts to increase in the land. Well, he can't be talking about beasts such as deer or antelope or other game animals. Those would be a huge benefit to someone coming into the land and would provide a much needed food source. It's not likely he's talking about lions and bears, as a group of trained hunters can be quite skillful at hunting and taking down large predatory animals of that size. We know at the time Israel and its 12 tribes had well-trained armies ready to deal in offensive tactics. Lions and bears would have been no match for groups of hunters or soldiers with shields and spears. It's obvious what is being referenced in Deuteronomy 7 verse 22 are beasts that are much more formidable in the land. How many soldiers or hunters would it take to bring down a T-Rex? How many hunters would be necessary to track and bring down predatory animals such as Velociraptor? What about removing a menace the size of a sauropod such as a Patasaurus or Brachiosaurus? That could surely bring havoc if one of those walked across your grain fields or wandered into one of your orchards. It would take lots of effort to remove these kinds of beasts, and because these people groups living in the land had already had the land tamed, the Father was letting that continue until it was time for Israel to move in and take over. Large predatory animals have always been pushed to the fringes of civilization. Nobody wants a T-Rex living in the neighborhood. For example, I live in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, at the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial Museum, located directly under the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, you will find a giant stuffed grizzly bear on display in the center of the main lobby area. You will also see 2 grizzly bears on the Missouri State Seal placed inside the state's flag. However, there hasn't been a grizzly bear population in Missouri in my lifetime or even in my grandparents' lifetime. These animals have long been pushed to the fringes of the American frontier. Likewise, for Israel, removing the people in the land of Canaan beforehand would have increased the beasts of the field, indeed just like the text says, thus making the initial inhabitation of the land a lot more difficult. The Bible has the word dragon mentioned in Scripture 35 times in the King James and early Greek manuscripts. Most modern Bible publications such as the NIV or ESV and others have taken out these references and replaced them with words such as jackal or serpent. They did this because the publishers were convinced that there were no such things as dragons because we have been erroneously led to believe that these creatures lived millions of years ago. Let's take a look at another example in Nehemiah chapter 2 verse 13. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well. Now, if you have a modern copyrighted translation, chances are the word dragon has been replaced with another word. But in all ancient manuscripts, the word used in this verse is dragon. The dragon well is commonly known to refer to the Gihon spring, located in a cave underneath Jerusalem. This was a vital water resource for the early settlers of Jerusalem. Gihon means gushing or bursting forth, and legend has it that the spring inside the cave would burst forth large amounts of water in a short period of time and then subside with no water. The early legends about this spring continued during the ages, with people in the area attributing the strange water burst to a dragon that supposedly lived in the cave below the spring. Today, the water no longer gushes out in the spring, and it's mostly believed that the bursting forth of water was due to an underground siphon system that probably collapsed over the years. Today, the Gihon spring gives its water at a pretty reliable pace. But what's interesting is the legend of a dragon living in the cave. Why a dragon? Why make up a story about a dragon living in a cave if there were not other stories of other dragons living in other caves? What should seem obvious to anyone is that in ancient times there was enough familiarity with dragons to think that maybe there was one living in the cave of the Gihon spring that was somehow causing the water to burst up out of the spring. This was before the times of Hollywood and movies with special effects. This was also before you could visit expensive and well-funded museums to see the bones of dinosaurs on display. So why the story of a dragon if the existence of dragons is supposedly fanciful modern-day fiction? We know from historical documents that soldiers from Alexander the Great's army encountered dragons in caves. Historical scribe Anaxagoras writes that Alexander's army encountered a great hissing monster inside of a cave in India. The locals worshipped the creature as a god and begged Alexander to leave the beast alone. It was written that the eyes of this dragon were the size of a Macedonian shield. Many other legends and stories exist concerning dragons living in caves. Another such example is the literary story of Siegfried, who comes to kill the dragon Fafnir, who also lives in a cave. History and literature give many examples of dragons living inside of caves. For more videos and studies, visit our website at newtotorah.com.